Monkey's paw is a phrase that refers to when you get your wish, but it comes true in this dark and twisted form that you didn't expect. And that is exactly the situation Bullet Hell are in right now. Because yes, we are getting our wish of Bullet Hell being a more marketable term, a term that people are having a growing respect for, and something that can help get your game attention and sales. Great, right? This is exactly what we're wanting. Indie Bullet Hell games are going to get the respect they finally deserve and get the sales that would be really great for the future stability of the genre, right? No, because of course in this world we live in, there is no justice, because rather than getting that type of scenario, which would be beautiful, instead, of course, how it's always going to play out is other genres are looking at Bullet Hell, but they're looking at them with a purely surface level understanding. And what's happening is that the most marketable aspect of the Bullet Hell, its aesthetic, its reputation, that is being taken, and other genres are starting to use it to cosplay and essentially present themselves as if they are somehow in line with this philosophy of game design. But you don't have that baggage of difficulty and depth and punishment and all the things that make Bullet Hell very difficult for a mainstream audience. So we're seeing this ugly pillaging of the genre that, yes, creates issues on a practical basis. Like now, if there's a Steam Shmup sale, the majority of the bigger titles at the top, not only are they not shmups, they're not even vaguely related to Bullet Hell either. And then, of course, if you look up the Bullet Hell tag on Steam, what are you getting? How much of actual Bullet Hell is being represented, and how much is it being crowded out by these other games and other genres that are more marketable in a mainstream sense, but they need something to help them stand out. And that is kind of the meta we're seeing, where you're going to make something that is meant for the palate of the mainstream player, that they will instantly connect with, that they'll instantly understand and recognize, that won't have the friction of something like a Bullet Hell shmup, and we'll talk about friction here in a minute. But the developer wants a unique aesthetic to help it stand out in the marketplace. And one of the go-to unique aesthetics that's starting to become a trend now is Bullet Hell. And so there is becoming a growing misunderstanding of what Bullet Hell even is. It's getting to the point now where if you have a 2D game and you put some projectiles in it, and those projectiles look like they're from Touhou or from Cave, Bullet Hell, baby. It's become just a purely aesthetic genre rather than what it should be, a philosophy of design. And an example of this is if you go on Wikipedia, and yes, I know Wikipedia isn't the bastion of game design knowledge, but there's really not a lot of resources on game design. And so if you go on Wikipedia, now there is a section in Wikipedia called Bullet Heaven, which is talking about these Vampire Survivor types of games. And we'll talk about Vampire Survivor here in a second. And there is a misunderstanding, I think, that Bullet Heaven in these Bullet Hell cosplaying types of games are somehow some kind of like natural branch of the Bullet Hell style of design. But that's not it. What's happening is that other genres that are not remotely related to Bullet Hell design are using its aesthetics, and then those aesthetics are now being understood on a surface level to represent the genre. But when you look at the deeper design of these games, not only are they unlike Bullet Hell games, but they often are antithetical to Bullet Hell's design philosophy, the arcade design philosophy, as in they are completely opposite of an arcade game. I think a better term for these types of games would be something like anti-Bullet Hell or Progressionhell. I think Progressionhell makes the most sense, actually, because Bullet Heaven, not only is it misleading, it makes no sense in the slightest. And so for today, I decided to look at 3 games that use the Bullet Hell tag on Steam: Vampire Survivors, Enter the Gungeon, and Rabi-Ribi. And the patrons suggested Rabi-Ribi to me because it's a Metroidvania that does seem to have more legitimate connection to Bullet Hell design. And so I thought it'd be interesting to take a look at that as well, because my point here isn't that developers, don't you touch bullet hell, don't you come near it. It's not that. My point is, if you want to incorporate bullet hell into your game in a real way, like you actually care about doing this and you actually respect the genre of bullet hell, that there are fundamental structures of this genre that you should also try to incorporate into your game as well. And so when it comes to evaluating the deeper characteristics of bullet hell design, I've created a list of 7 things that I'm looking for. Now, this isn't writ law. These are just 7 characteristics that I think really create that bullet hell dynamic. And also, like I said in my Birth of Bullet Hell video, bullet hell is a gradient of a subgenre, meaning that there is not like one clear defining point where now it's a bullet hell. It's more of a combination of multiple elements that synergize together. And so these are some of those elements we're trying to find. The first one is level design is created by projectiles and enemies. That is very distinct of the bullet hell genre. Touhou is such a clear example of this. There's no environmental obstacles. There's no terrain like with old school shmups. The entire level is defined by the projectiles themselves and by the enemy placement. The placement of the enemies and the projectiles they create are environment. And the second thing I'm looking for is that bullets are a meaningful threat. That seems kind of obvious, but you'd be surprised. A lot of games have bullets, so they say, but the bullets don't have a meaningful type of impact in terms of how you have to navigate around them.
Yeah, normally this boss is a 2-cycle, but kind of lacking the damage now because of bad luck on weapon drops and, you know, taking the damage earlier.
Alright, another thing, this is a bullet hell game.
Maybe you absorb the bullet, maybe the bullet is some sort of resource, or maybe the bullet is just a purely aesthetic element that's not really impacting the gameplay all that much. And so the more meaningful the bullet itself is in terms of the gameplay, the more bullet hell the game is. And going along with that, bullet hell has an emphasis on micro dodging. This is the real dividing point of the subgenre between classic shmup and bullet hell shmup. Classic shmups tend to be more macro routing based, which is also very cool. But if you want that bullet hell flavor, it's all about the micro dodging, baby. And micro dodging is having to navigate around very clustered, tight hitboxes. And it comes down to really knowing, like down to the pixel, how the hitboxes interact with each other and squeezing through these clusters and formations with your own tiny hitbox. That's actually the 4th criteria for bullet hell, the player hitbox. The player hitbox needs to be smaller than the sprite itself. You need that disjoint between the hitbox size and the player sprite size. And basically, the more disjointed it is in terms of small hitbox, big player sprite, the more bullet hell it kind of is, basically. Battle Traverse is such a great example of this because it's like hilariously exaggerated. You have this immense player sprite and this tiny hitbox, but that's bullet hell. If you go back to my Birth of Bullet Hell video, it comes from a programming bug, essentially, or like kind of an oversight. But then the design team realized, oh, this is like really awesome. And so they rolled with it. And so that became a real defining feature of bullet hell. So for example, Vampire Survivors, your entire sprite is a hitbox. Like your foot is a hitbox. It has no hitbox to sprite disjoint. Going along with that is the enemy attacks. The enemy attacks in bullet hell are more fuzzy, but they have dodgeable gaps. That's really important. You don't have true walls in bullet hell, or if you have true walls, it's very selective. A true wall is something that you cannot squeeze through. Where in bullet hell, the way it works is there's lots of giant clusters of bullets. The reason why the clustering aspect matters is because clusters can break apart. Time affects clusters, drift affects clusters. All of these different elements of spacing, timing, and movement affect how bullets come together. And so a core skill of bullet hell is maybe on the surface an attack looks like a wall, but through proper positioning, spacing, preemptive, leading and stuff, you can break open clusters and create gaps in them. and then you use your tiny little hitbox to squeeze through those gaps. The sixth thing I'm looking for is something that I don't want to see. What I do not want to see are forced hits or forced iframes. What I mean by that is in a lot of scenarios in bullet hell shmups, especially like TLB fights and stuff like that, patterns can be insane. And in a practical sense, you're gonna bomb them. Look at Hibachi. But a core sort of law of bullet hell design is you can never force that to be the case. You can push it to absurd levels, but there should be a way to get through the enemy patterns without having to take a hit and without having to use iframe moves. So the old dodge roll in Enter the Gungeon is very un-bullet hell because Enter the Gungeon has a lot of attacks and a lot of sequences where it's just like use iframes. But bullet hell is all about fundamental spacing and moving. Iframes are an emergency lever you pull when you're like, oh, And the last dynamic I want to highlight is proximity damage, aka point blanking. This is such an important feature of bullet hell design because it allows for simple natural spacing to now have an effect on damage output, where the closer you are to the enemy, the more damage you're able to deal. And by getting close and dealing more damage, then you're able to shut down a lot of attacks that would build up upon each other and snowball and crush you at the bottom of the screen. So if you want to survive, you need to play aggressively. But in order to play aggressively, you need to get close. And by getting close, now you're taking a bigger risk because you have less time to get around their attacks. You have less time to react to what is coming. So therefore, you need to have more familiarity with the level design, more familiarity with the enemy attacks. It's a simple but incredibly deep mechanic that rewards knowledge and courage, essentially, and punishes pacifism and lack of knowledge. Those are the 7 criteria of bullet hell and what makes your game feel like really bullet hell. And now let's see how these games sort of hold up to the bullet hell philosophy. So let's start with Vampire Survivors because it's obviously the biggest offender on this list. To begin with, let's talk about the elements of Vampire Survivors that appear bullet hell-like on the surface. The big one is obviously the fact that there is no classical level design in this game. You are fighting enemies in this open combat arena, kind of like that section in Guange actually, and the enemies create the entire dynamic of the level design essentially. You've got a little bit of like walls and objects here and there, but very much like a bullet hell, it comes down to the enemy design to create the dynamic of the stages. On paper, that's a cool idea, except in practice, Vampire Survivors has no enemy design, and it has no bullets, literally. So it cannot be bullet hell because it has no bullets. And you could say, and I've heard people say this, oh, but what's cool about it is that the enemy design is now the bullets. And when you say that, that invokes in my mind Devil Daggers, where that is actually the case. Devil Daggers has different enemy types, and the enemy types have different behavioral patterns, and when they mix together, it creates sort of a bullet hell type of effect. Some enemies fully track you, some enemies have like weird turning, some enemies will fly in the air and spawn shit. There is enemy design in Devil Daggers, but Vampire Survivors does not have enemy design because there is no variation in the enemy type. The only variation in enemy type is how much of a damage sponge they are and how quickly they move. But all enemy behavior in Vampire Survivors is just fully tracking the player. That's it. There's no variation in the way they track you. There's not some that hold still. There's not some that will synergize together into like different formations. And every now and then you will see some slight exceptions that give you a bit of hope, like, oh, maybe there's some proper enemy design on the way. But those slight exceptions just help point out how intentionally underdeveloped this game's core combat system is. But here's the thing about Vampire Survivors I want to emphasize is that I do not think the lack of development in its core gameplay is an oversight. I think it is completely intentional. Keep that in mind because we're going to talk about that in a little bit. When you first play the game, you think there's more to it than there actually is, because you're like, oh, okay, so there's going to be like formations of things that start to spawn and they start to really affect how the game is played. But that's not what ends up happening, because ultimately what the meta of Vampire Survivors comes down to is damage per second, DPS, because since everything fully tracks you, the movement patterns for the player become extremely uniform and static. The ambiguity of a bullet hell in terms of movement, spacing, routing is all intentionally eliminated, because the biggest hurdle for newer players coming into the bullet hell shmup genre is understanding the spatial routing of the game. But in Vampire Survivors, you don't have to think about your movement. You don't have to think about your strategy, because it is literally the same strategy the entire time. The developer made sure of this by not allowing other types of enemy behavior, projectiles, hell forbid. And so what ends up happening is that the only meaningful routing that occurs, the only meaningful decision making is in the progression system, is in your damage output. And so what Vampire Survivors is a progression system with a game attached to it. That's why I think it should be called Progressionhell. Why is the game designed like this? Why is the developer intentionally simplifying the game down to such a streamlined version of what bullet hell and shmup design is, even down to the point where you can't manually control your attacks, down to the point where everything is pretty much automated except your movement? And like I said, with the fully tracking enemies, that itself is highly reduced. The reason for that is because what Vampire Survivors is attempting to do is to remove the friction of a bullet hell. And a huge shout out to Bog Hog for researching gambling design in video games. He's been a massive resource with this and has introduced me to these concepts. Friction is the idea in casino game design that you want to remove all potential mechanisms and slight barriers between the gambler and the slot machine. And that is the entire design philosophy around Vampire Survivors. The creator himself does actually have a legit background in gambling game design, and it clearly shows. And what's very interesting about this is that this gambling game design is the exact same style of design that modern Western developers really promote and emphasize. And so if you took Vampire Survivors as a student and you walked into game design school and you set that down on your professor's desk, it would blow your professor's mind. He'd be like, this is it. This is the epitome of modern game design. You did it. Because what Vampire Survivors is a progression system. That is the game. And you can see this clearly in the way the game communicates itself, the way you level up, the casino style, like, oh my God, you leveled up. And then if you go to open a box, you get this insane cutscene. The disconnect between the production value in the progression system and the production value in the actual gameplay is hilarious. Because if you look at the enemy design, for example, it's really minimalistic, especially if you turn off the damage numbers. All that happens when you hit an enemy is they have a pushback, they have a flash, and then when they die, they just kind of melt into nothingness. And I've talked about on the channel a lot before, like, you want enemy interaction in a bullet hell and a shmup to be very rewarding and visceral and satisfying. So if you look at like Grega or like Dodonpachi, DOJ and everything, when things blow up in those games, there's explosions on explosions. It's like a real event because the gameplay itself is the reward. Vampire Survivors, very modern. The gameplay itself is just a means to progression. The progression is the reward. The progression is the key. And what ends up happening is with the philosophy of bullet hell and of arcade game design, the whole concept is that your progression is internal to your own skill. As in, if you have Mushihime-sama on Steam and you've played Mushihime-sama 2,000 hours on Steam, it wouldn't matter if you uninstalled Mushihime-sama and then reinstalled it, especially since if your scores are on an online leaderboard. Meta progression is not a thing. Every playthrough is clean and self-contained like a real game, like in chess. So there is no meta progression in Bullet Hell. Bullet Hell is self-contained. The progression is inside you as a player skill-wise, and then it gets externalized as score. Vampire Survivors, this is not the case. The way the game works is it's just checking for DPS. That's all it's doing. So as you progress through the level, it's just, have you attained the correct amount of DPS or not? And if you have, then what occurs is what I call RPG breakaway. And what RPG breakaway is when the progression RPG elements of your character and of the game overwhelm the enemy and level design. And what ends up happening is that now you don't have to even worry about playing the game, essentially. Like in Pokemon, if you get like a level 70 Alakazam or something and you just psychic everything throughout the rest of the game, that's RPG breakaway, where it feeds on itself. And that's what you see happening in Vampire Survivors. And it's intentional, by the way. It makes you feel like your progression and skill are interlinked with each other, but it isn't. It's deceptive. It's tricking you. And that is why I don't respect this style of game design. I can understand that there are types of games out there that really focus on progression as their whole gameplay concept, JRPGs and so forth. And even though I don't personally connect with just playing purely for progression, I very much like games that incorporate skill as the core basis of their design. Even so, those types of games like JRPGs are honest about what they are. And they are trying their best to make that style of design engaging. The thing about Vampire Survivors is, yes, it's engaging, like a casino, but in a way that I find very cynical rather than open and honest. And so that is where a lot of the debate around Vampire Survivors on this channel will probably differ from most other channels, because a lot of other channels, even if they identify this aspect of Vampire Survivors, they like respect the hustle, essentially. Like, oh yeah, this game is totally designed to be basically addictive and to remove friction and to remove depth and skill in place of just this passive consumption.
Now, the reason I highlighted convenience up there or progress is that most of your sales will be here. Progress is that most of your sales will be here. Now, if we look at this from a monetization perspective, the hook is where you put up an icebreaker. You want to give a really, really good deal, something that's a no-brainer. You would be crazy to turn it down as a player. The core loop goes through the store. You do your action, your in-game, your core game there, and you go straight into the meta game where you do the upgrades, and then back there. So the loop always goes through the meta stage where your store, where you're spending money. Remember, there are 4 ways of progressing in games in general. You can have a skill-based game, you can have a luck-based game, you can have a game where you just progress by grinding, or you can pay to progress. Make sure that your games aren't too skill-based. I made that mistake myself. A too skill-based game, you don't get people to pay you because there's no reason to. So make sure grinding and paying are legitimate versions of progressing in the game.
I am aware that Vampire Survivors does not have microtransactions, but I also find it very interesting that a game that so heavily conditions the player into a microtransaction style environment is getting such high praise by Western gaming press. But anyway, in Vampire Survivors, the only skill-based aspect of a run is that early phase of getting enough leveling up to then create the RPG breakaway, and then you break away and you're fine. The thing about it, though, is that even that gets subverted because they have this merchant guy, so you can just go buy level ups. So even that gets subverted by the progression system. How you get good at Vampire Survivors is by learning to grind very quickly. What I want to point out about progression-based design in games, and this is something that I really am excited for people to look at is lots of games have progression systems to varying degrees of quality. For example, Devil May Cry 3 has a progression system, right? To unlock the moves and unlock all the stuff. That's a progression system. Lots of games have progression system elements. Some work better than others. But the fundamental question you have to ask yourself is, what happens post-progression? So with Devil May Cry, for example, the progression system is kind of this obnoxious barrier into the real game, but once you're in the real game, it still holds together, it's still really good. Obviously, arcade games don't have progression systems, so they're just the real game all the time. Vampire Survivors is much more of an RPG in the fact that once you get to the end of the progression system, the game is over. And because it has meta progression, there is no such thing as a self-contained playthrough, because each session affects the other sessions. And so you can never really have a true sense of failure or success, because even if you lose, well, you get to carry over the XP into the next run. And then once you have the progression system completed, you're getting XP, but now it's meaningless. So it's this state of constant purgatory where you're neither winning nor losing. And so what's interesting is that modern gamers definitely sense this dynamic, but it's not really placed into too critical of a framework. For example, if I were to say, download Vampire Survivors and download a 100% save file and play the game, a lot of people would say, no, that ruins the game. The game doesn't work if you do that, which is accurate. But then what is the game if you download a 100% save file and that invalidates the game? That means the game is the progression system. The game is the save file. And that's why you get all this interesting language around save files in modern games, where, for example, the uploader will literally put in the description for people being lazy. There's this real negative connotation around using save files in modern games because the save file is the game. There's nothing beyond that. Whereas with arcade games, as in with roguelike games, real games that have the internal skill be the actual progression of the player, you can download save files for Mushi all day, every day. You could download save files for the original Rogue game or the new port of it, where all a save file is in a game that's meant to be played in a single sequence is just a temporary checkpoint. And these games emphasize playing through them without saving, with the Iron mode. And so the more the save file is precious, the more progression-based the system is. The less precious the save file tends to be, the more skill-based it likely is. Even with a game like Demon's Souls, I've started doing single-segment runs through Demon's Souls, and so I am now constantly resetting save files in that game. And you could say, oh, I learned to beat Vampire Survivors levels, really under-leveled and all that, but that's great and everything, but why? Because it's actually much more effective to just get really good at grinding and grind fast. And the faster you grind, I would say you're actually the better player. Like a guy that can take a Vampire Survivors save file and go from 0 to 100 in a few hours, I would say that guy is actually more skilled at the game in a sense, because the whole game is a meta progression. A really obvious example of this is when you're leveling within the stage, you get to a certain point where you essentially max out your leveling, and then you have a choice of what to do from that point onward. You can either auto gain more experience, which is obviously the intended thing you're doing, because again, that's feeding into the meta progression. That's actually the end goal here. But once the meta progression is over, that seems pointless. So then you'll just auto refresh heal. And so you can just auto refresh heal for the rest of the run. And then you get to the end of the run, and it's well, what did that accomplish? Vampire Survivors on the surface presents itself as if it is related to a bullet hell or to the genre, but it actually is much more related to an RPG. And if that's your thing, if you love meta progression and you love grinding and you love that type of stuff, that's fine. But don't classify the game as if it's somehow a bullet hell. That's the sticky wicket here. Understand what it is. It is a progression system. So no, Vampire Survivors is not a bullet hell in the slightest. It is a progression hell. and I do not appreciate it being listed along in bullet hells. Second on the list is Enter the Gungeon. Maybe because I just spent the week playing a bunch of Vampire Survivors, maybe that softened me up to Enter the Gungeon. Like in comparison, where Vampire Survivors seems so calculated and so intentionally manipulative. Now I look at Enter the Gungeon with like, okay, you're not really a bullet hell Enter the Gungeon, but there's a lot less cynicism to this game. It's much more like trying to sort of incorporate some bullet hell ideas. I don't think it quite accomplishes that, but just in comparison to this stuff we're seeing now, I can be a bit more charitable to Enter the Gungeon, I think. So first of all, I would say Enter the Gungeon, when you're playing it and you're having fun with it, I do think it can be fun at times, but it is not a bullet hell. I would actually say it is clearly a cover shooter. And I think the only reason why it's not classified as a cover shooter is because cover shooters, I think unfairly, because I actually like a lot of cover shooters, like Dead to Rights and Vanquish as well, a really good cover shooter. But cover shooters don't have that same sort of like indie credibility as a bullet hell does. And so I think they're like leaning into the bullet hell classification for marketing, but really it should definitely be defined as a cover shooter. It like has every element of a cover shooter. Like it's way more like Dead to Rights or Max Payne. For example, your dodge roll. That's cover shooter. And the fact the level design itself is like you have literal cover mechanics in the game with tables, and when you enter a room, there's like pillars, and it's all about like using cover and like popping out and shooting things and then like rolling back behind cover. And then even when you're in like kind of the more open boss fights, those boss fights are often balanced around using your dodge roll in the patterns, which is a tradition that goes all the way back to arcade cover shooters like Cabal. So even in that sense, it has that cover shooter DNA. At times, Enter the Gungeon will have some semblance of micro, but going back to criteria 4, the player hitbox in Enter the Gungeon is like full-on giant. There's not any of that hitbox to sprite disconnect. I'm sure it's not like one-to-one like Vampire Survivors, which is absurd, but it's definitely really big. If you're going for a shmup comparison, it plays much more like a classic shmup than a bullet hell. The dodging elements, it's always going to be better to macro around things than trying to micro through them. And so I think this is a situation where Enter the Gungeon, it's not a bullet hell in the slightest, but it is at least its own coherent game. It's just purely using bullet hell aesthetics. But if you took Enter the Gungeon and you just changed the art style into like Max Payne or something, everyone would instantly be like, that's a top-down cover shooter. That's what the game is. And then with the procedural generation of the floors, I think that is also very un-bullet hell-like, because bullet hells are all about creating routing and time. I do actually appreciate that Enter the Gungeon will swap out the bosses. I think that works. But the shuffling of the rooms is a problem, because not only can you not like hard route through the rooms like you would in a bullet hell, but also on top of that, you can't even condense down risk and reward super well, because the idea would be is that you would hard route to the bosses. And the risk reward of that would be you'd have less resources, but in the process, you'd get through things more quickly. And so that way you could use skill to differentiate yourself from other players, especially since Enter the Gungeon has a speedrun mode. And so we'll take speedrunning as essentially the replacement for scoring in this game. But when they added the speedrun mode, they also really should have added a solid level layout mode. Not that they couldn't maybe mix things up with how the enemies like are placed in the rooms, but in terms of the way the map is laid out, I want to go through the first 3 floors directly to the boss. And if the game was more like solidly laid out, they could even have some RNG where maybe they've got like 3 rooms between you and the boss every time, and they could put like different in those rooms. But because the layout of the levels is less predictable and chaotic, what can end up happening is through the RNG, I could get through the first floor, find the boss right away, or through the RNG, I would find the boss room last. And so just because of the way that works. I actually ended up leveling up more and getting more resources than I was intending to. And so when they added the speedrun mode, they really should have added in a static room placement on top of that, because apparently with the room layouts, there is some sort of like underlying logic that you can sort of figure out to make the room layouts more consistently predictable so that you can speedrun to the boss as soon as possible. That's what the speedrunners are trying to do, right? That is the performance of the game. I was like looking into it, and they're like having to do all of this complicated calculations to figure this out, and there's all these variables and branches. Like, Enter the Gungeon, what are you doing to your poor speedrunners? You add the speedrun mode, which I think is great. You add faster movement out of combat. That's a great idea. But you don't add in some static layouts for your poor speedrunners. So I definitely want to give the game credit for building in its speedrunning mode. I only comment on speedrunning meta when it is formally acknowledged by the game, as we're seeing here. But the trade-off is, if you're going to build in a speedrunning mode and have that be a legit design feature of your game, you should probably then think more coherently about what that entails in terms of the skills you're asking this mode to test of the player. Is the skill test of the speedrun the player's ability to move, the player's ability to fight enemies and deal with bosses and not take damage and all of the fundamentals of the system combat? Or is the skill test the player's ability to figure out the underlying logic of your room generation and figuring out the odds of where the boss room will be? And even if they do that, they are still subjected to the RNG of where the boss room is and where it isn't based off of where they spawn. Obviously, in speedrunning, there's always going to be a little bit of this factor with the boss shuffle, or if you shuffled the enemies in the rooms, some of these would be more optimal than others. But I think that is a little bit more within the window of acceptability than you roll one time and the boss room is way across the stage, and then you roll another time and you're like right next to it. That is just too statistically re-roll style of RNG that I do not think works well with a skill performance system like speedrunning is supposed to be. Compared to Vampire Survivors, Enter the Gungeon is a lot more solid of a game, but it's not a bullet hell. But if you understand that it's a cover shooter, and I really wish if they just presented it as what it is, it's a lot easier to accept as a game than when it first came out and it was telling me it's a bullet hell. And I'm like trying to micro things and like trying to dodge things. It's a nightmare. If you try to actually play it like a bullet hell, it doesn't work in the slightest. It's because it's not. And then we come to Rabi-Ribi. The patrons wanted me to take a look at this, and Rabi-Ribi is really interesting. So in terms of a lot of our criteria, Rabi-Ribi actually does fulfill quite a lot of them. And you can tell playing the game that this developer has some background, especially with Touhou. You can definitely see, unlike the other two here, the Rabi-Ribi developer knows about bullet hell and plays bullet hell. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately because there seems to be this real attempt happening to pull together Metroidvania with bullet hell. And I think I know why. It's because there is a real possible complementary relationship between the two, where Metroidvania has that more open-ended, accessible design that bullet hell devs want to be able to present to an audience. Like I was saying before, I do think it's kind of a good project to try to make something that would bring new people into bullet hell. And so Metroidvania are a possible avenue to do this with the more forgiving nature of their level design, essentially. And then what bullet hell has to offer that Metroidvania desperately needs is amazing boss fights. Because think about Metroidvanias prior to like a bullet hell influence on them, Super Metroid and Castlevania. I mean, I love Super Metroid, but boss fights in Super Metroid are kind of a joke in terms of like their depth and difficulty. The fun of the boss fights in Super Metroid is the speedrunning meta of them. Like, can you quick kill guys, and can you fight Ridley with just a few weapons? Ridley's like the closest to like a really good boss fight in that game. But the rest of the boss fights are just kind of a joke. Same thing with Symphony of the Night. And so Bullet Hell really have something to give Metroidvania that they need. They need amazing boss fights and boss design. And so we're seeing, especially with like Touhou style projects, kind of this cool synergy happening between Bullet Hell and Metroidvania in terms of the boss fights. And with Rabi-Ribi, it's clearly the best part of the game. And if you fight the boss fights under what's called low item percent, you can get some legit, real Bullet Hell stuff for the most part. But the problem with Rabi-Ribi is the problem that this fusion seems to be really struggling with, which is the rest of the game outside of the boss fight, like the level design. How do you equate Bullet Hell style level design with Metroidvania style level design? Because Metroidvania style level design is all about moving through the rooms quickly, but in the process of that happening, that ends up undermining bullets are a meaningful threat. Because if you have enemies and bullets in these types of games, usually you just navigate around them and you route around them. And as a designer, it's very hard to make meaningful threats constantly happen in a Metroidvania level design, because the rooms need to go both directions or many directions, right? You need to account for where the player's coming from, where the player is going, and also just the rote nature of traversal in these games. The player just wants to get from A to Z, and they don't want to deal with the stuff in between. And then how do you make the things in between meaningful? I think there are multiple ways to kind of try to attempt this, and Rabi-Ribi does attempt some of this, but in the process, it also ends up damaging a lot of its Bullet Hell elements. For example, one way you can make traversal between bosses meaningful is you add in leveling mechanics, damage mechanics, so that when you're killing things in the levels, you're doing so in order to power up, which feeds into the combat, right? But then the problem with that is
grinding,
the ultimate anti-skill game design element. And so when you get into the boss fights of Rabi-Ribi and you are dealing with these legitimately difficult patterns, you're like, man, this is really tough. These patterns are really hard. How are other players dodging these patterns? And then you look up online and it's like, oh yeah, just exploit DPS. Overpower the game with the RPG mechanics. And that's the problem of progression systems. So Rabi-Ribi does not have the meta-progression problem like the other two games does, but it has the good old-fashioned progression system problem of why learn when you can grind. Grinding is such an enemy of good game design, because whenever you present the player with a difficult challenge, if you can grind away the challenge, that tends to be the go-to solution. And Rabi-Ribi, I think, kind of attempts to sort of mitigate this in some soft ways. You can tell this game has a lot more of awareness of these dynamics than the other two. Like, for example, there is like an official low percent, so you can't get above 10%. And so that would kind of encourage you to now learn how to fight bosses and stuff like that. Except the problem with that is that
low percent.
There's not like a dedicated mode in the menu that you select. It's just like this soft sort of state that exists while you're playing that isn't really like so formally recognized and communicated to the player. And you compare that to something like Radiant Silvergun. Silvergun does this correctly because Silvergun has progression leveling mechanics, hilariously enough, where the more you chain and score, the more it actually levels up the strength of your weapons. But why Silvergun works, where Rabi-Ribi does not, is that Silvergun does not have grinding, because it's an auto-scrolling shmup. You cannot go back and grind encounters. You have to catch the encounters as they're coming. And so you can get yourself in situations, I know I did with my 1cc, where you have to route the leveling of your weapons. Like XP and leveling up is now actually part of your skill and routing, because you have to like literally decide, all right, I need to take a risk here to go for this chain here in order to level the weapon up here, so that when I'm in the final boss here, this weapon's strong enough to get through the pattern before this really crazy pattern appears and stuff like that. And so those dynamics could technically appear in a Metroidvania, but they often don't because of grinding. And so Rabi-Ribi, in the pure boss fight sense, it definitely does a much better job of capturing these bullet hell dynamics. Even with something like your hammer weapon, that approximates point blanking really well, kind of like Aura in Dodonpachi, but the leveling mechanics and kind of the Metroidvania structure, in my opinion, unfortunately overwhelm its bullet hell dynamics. And you can actually see this reflected in the fan base of Rabi-Ribi, where yes, you have some bullet hell fans of Rabi-Ribi, but if you look at the majority of people who play Rabi-Ribi and talk about Rabi-Ribi, they approach it much more from the Metroidvania side of things. There's a speedrun of Rabi-Ribi at GDQ, and the commentator is mentioning that, yeah, Rabi-Ribi has some bullet hell elements to it, but unfortunately, you're not going to really see those on screen because in order to speedrun the game, which is officially a mode in the game, by the way, so that is mostly what the game is intending you to do, is to play through it as quickly as possible. Why learn to dodge patterns when you can DPS your way through it?
Yeah, you might not see it much in this run, but the bosses in this game are actually really likened to bullet hell bosses, such as like Touhou games or things like that. Their attacks are quite varied. Each of the bosses has quite a bit of attacks, but you're hopefully not going to see too many of them.
It's about killing things faster, and sometimes apparently like killing things faster in the low difficulty mode can be kind of technical, but that actually is, again, much more like Super Metroid. And so Rabi-Ribi, it's definitely getting closer than the other two, and I think is more representative of bullet hell design, to the point where it's like, okay, you can have the bullet hell tag, Rabi. Especially if you play the boss rush mode, which is giving you much more of an uncut bullet hell experience. But of course, why? It is locked, and you have to unlock it by completing story mode, which is not very bullet hell. That's, again, that RPG progression stuff that we're trying to get away from. And again, you can tell that the Rabi-Ribi players are mostly on the Metroidvania side of things, because I saw a guy on Steam asking for a save file so he could play the boss rush mode, and the response from the players was like, nah, playa. What, you just want to play the bullet hell mode of the game? What's wrong with you, dude? So, yeah, I think that could have been a really strong saving grace for the game in terms of just recommending it to Shmup fans. Be like, buy it and play the boss rush mode, and you have a really cool game right there. But asking bullet hell players to go through its kind of not the best Metroidvania style of design does hold it back in a way that I think is pretty unnecessary, to be honest. And the crazy thing about Rabi-Ribi is this is a really long-running release and tons of content, tons of updates, and so many modes. But I would really want to see something with a very upfront, immediate structure that would pull you into the bullet hell dynamics a lot more, because Rabi-Ribi is pretty complicated and hard to figure out. I was like trying to figure out where to go and what to do, and there's so many mechanics and stuff like that. So it's got a lot of heart, but I don't think it quite has the focus and execution that I would like to see. And what I mean is that there's clearly so much content that this game has to offer, but it's the type of game that, because it's so unfocused, it's really asking you to take a really big leap into what is happening, and it feels more like you're collaborating with the game rather than the game having a really defined, strong, coherent experience, which is really common for these big, sprawling, indie Metroidvania-style games, because volume is something that is very natural to this style of game design. But the problem is that in order to make this fusion with bullet hell work on a deeper level beyond just even having like great bullet hell boss fights, in terms of structure, in terms of creating something that feels bullet hell through and through, you need to have a more focused experience. That bullet hells, shmups, they auto-scroll. They have a natural inborn sense of pace. And I know a Metroidvania is not the type of genre that's going to auto-scroll, so then what you need to do with the structure of the game is create this very powerful forward momentum through the other avenues of the game's design to get that same effect. And I don't think Rabi-Ribi is able to do that really well. It's very disjointed and has you go here to there, and you're not quite sure exactly what's going on the whole time. It's very sporadic and broken up, and so it ends up being much more of a Metroidvania style experience with really fun bullet hell boss fights when you're not engaging with grinding and stuff like that. Yeah, it's a step forward, definitely, compared to the other two here, but not quite the silver bullet I would want to see in terms of fusing together Metroidvania with bullet hell. But still, it's definitely close enough to earn its bullet hell tag on Steam, I think. And so that is today's video on the bullet hell hostage situation, the monkey paw of bullet hell in 2025. And do I think my comments and critiques are going to stop this trend? Absolutely not. But hopefully what I'm trying to do is at least inform the trend a little bit. So at least we have a way to discuss the relationship between these games and bullet hell a bit more clearly. Maybe Progressionhell can catch on, because I think that would make a lot more sense and really help differentiate these styles of games away from bullet hell. So thanks so much. And if you enjoyed this review, definitely check out a little sleeper video of mine, which is the birth of bullet hell, where I'm talking about Donpachi, Cave, and the makings of where bullet hell came from. I think that would really complement a lot of the discussion we have here today. And if you can, please like, subscribe, tell all your friends. I'm a full-time YouTuber, so if you could support me on Patreon, that would be fantastic. That's how this channel happens. And there's lots of cool exclusive content on there as well that I think you all will enjoy. Adios, everyone. So thank you to the $5 and $8 patrons: 100, Absconditis, Accepting Panda, Handhold, AJA, AJD578, Alistair Stevenson, Alberto Starna, Alex, Alexander Pfeiffer, AMH, Anthony A, Arvin Gordon, Arcade Hell, Arrow Viper, Au Li, Autoname, Battle Mode, Bo, Ben Foster, Benjamin Shabalski, Vito Dames, Bog Hog, Board Basmati, Borky22, Brokeface, Brent Cox, Brian Lucy, Captain Rhodes, Chase Palumbo, Chaflip, Kristen Sokal, Christopher R, Chronic Burnout 3, Kipolino, Clairvoyant Bongwater, Claire Clay Binkley, Five Coyote, Post, Concreted, Cooksan 666, Cookson Soup, Choreo, Crew Expendable, CSP 3900, Des Audio, Dan Matei, Danchi, Darren Griffin, Dat Guy, David Aldrus, David Crespo, Dididun, Demian Smirnov, Desolus, Dimension Diver, Dio Domke, DJ420 Praise It, Drano, Dr. Bosky, Duckies, Eduardo Oquinta, Edvard, Elvin Senesev, Elias Alonso, Epson Eagle, Eric Shrivner, Eric Houdini, Esteban Luzama, Explosive General Games, Fabio Picci, Falcus, Fenich, Fiskin, Five Side, Florida Sucks, Forbidden Dave, Frames Per Human, Francisco, Freckle Lord, Full Set, Game Soup, Game Boy Guru, Gelhoff, Gojira Green, GPM, Gustavo Sanchez, Hawk Hans Kowalski, Hero Death, Holy, Han Harthy, HUD, Humongous, JDab, Jake Ryan, Jack Walls, Jacob Grossman, Jacob Valenzuela, Jay McCarthy, J67, JLab, JBRPG, Jink Hans, JMD, John Kelly, John Longwalker, John Simpson, John Slaylise, Jorge Figueroa, Josaka, Josh Mayer, Julian Elwood, Jurgen, K, K2, Kane Evans, Ken10082, Kill All Music, Contain, Praise the Boys, Kai Arts, Leonardo McCoy, Ludwa, Alberta, Lord Harrington, Luna Lilich, LZR Cuter, Macabre Monster, Mad Combaticus, Malaise, Maplewood, Mario Simic, Mark Mann, Mason Polar, Master Zeon, Matt O'Leary, Matthew Woodford, Maz, Minong, Meister, Mewjam, Michael De Polito, Michael Faircloth, Michael McCord, Mig ZVM, Mike Mel, Milo Shamel, Mr. Mamma Mia, Mitwid, M. Kusanagi, Morag, Monroe, Munsta Zero, Miles P, Michigan, Naps91, Queen Charlene, Nathan Grimm, Nathaniel Davis, NCR Trooper Scout, Nico Pero, Neon Dagger Games, Nervous J, Nogden, Okla Kugels, Oleg Tomatisev, Oregano Dog, Panzer Dragoon Should Have Been Arcade, Patrick Basteman, Paul Jablonski, Paul Osterman, Powell Parole, Peace, Pedro Montoya, Pedro Isiles, Philip Plus, PLP, Poor Little Pigeon, Poorly Written Protagonist, PRK, Psycho Blizzard, Kulan Jaeger, R2 Sinus, Ralph Trujillo, Randoom, Raoul VP, Repeato, RC, Realskeen, Brent Holtz Time, Retro Jet, Retro Man, Retro Masters, Retro Schmupper, Riff Mason, Rip the Jacker, Robert Chang, Rory Starks, Wolf015, Salmon Connections, Sam, Sanivo, Scanline City, Scott Ernicus, Segfault, Shader Bunny, Shazzy, Shmup Junkie, Siropong, Social Kid, Spiders STG, Spongy, Steady AI, Steplable, Steve Fiction, Street Magic, Superfunk, Swoop, Synthmilk, Tamzarian, Taze Ryu, Thana Oat, The Boot Rex, The Dirty Screech, The N1, The Old Bensta, Tom McCarthy, Tim French, TK Productions, Travis Arbon, Tristan, Sugumo, Turam, 2IU, Twest Please, Twilight EX, Tyler Olu, Ursua, Ushimushi, Video Game Enjoyer, Beautiful, Vulgarity, Wabby Legs, What Is This, Yellow Tello, Your Nerdy Joe, Yusef Khaled, Zachary Patton, Zach, Zeal, Zinryoku, Zingus.